Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to our show today. Today I have a very special guest who has written a very remarkable book. I'm going to be speaking with Stephen Mwangi, a London-based lawyer and theorist and lecturer in law at the University of Kent. And he's also a visiting lecturer in constitutional, administrative, and human rights law at City University in London. He recently published this terrific book entitled Black Iconography and Colonial Reproduction at the International Criminal Court. There is the amazing cover of this book. And in which he argues quite cogently about the fundamental racism behind both the establishment and the practice of international criminal law. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome you, Mwangi Wawanjiru, to join us on this show. Congratulations on really a very interesting book, and I'm glad that we have this opportunity, because I think it is a book that deserves much wider discussion than I feel it has had thus far. I wish we had been the publisher of this remarkable book. So if I can ask you, Mwangi, well, let's just start. I mean, bring us up to date. What is the International Criminal Court? I mean, people talk about it, but we don't necessarily know much about it. Well, give us some sort of context for us.
Yeah, well, thank you, Philos, for having me. Thank you so much, and thank you for those very kind words on this text, which I think really, your words captures, what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to challenge what seems to be, if you like, the orthodox on international law generally. And then international criminal court is not very new now. Is a couple of decades now, and also really is a continuation of what has been building since the 1990s. If you remember the movement for democratization of Africa, and late 90s, early 2000s, the chaos that erupts in several African countries. And then you have the international, if you like, the United Nations, thinking there has to be a way of resolving these ongoing conflicts, particularly in places like Eastern Congo. And they come up with this criminal court, which is based at The Hague, where member states were supposed to sign the founding statute, which is the Rome Statute. And surprisingly, some of the major powers like the United States, China, India, Russia, as we probably will touch on, are not signatories. This criminal court has been in action for the last at least 10 years or so. It's brought a couple of very controversial cases. I touch on the Kenyan cases. I touch on the Sudanese cases. I touch on the cases from Ivory Coast and from Congo in the book. And it's been very controversial because it's brought cases against mostly African leadership so far. But we're probably going to touch on is now trying to charge President Putin with what's happening at the minute in Ukraine. But mostly is dealt with African leadership. And the idea was that crimes against humanity are crimes against if you like, everybody globally and should be tried by us all globally. But what seems to have happened so far until the Ukraine situation is that this court has always charged leadership from Africa. And most of these cases from Africa, anyway, have not been successful. So most of these cases against, for example, the former Kenyan president Uhuru Kenyatta and the current Kenyan president William Ruto failed dramatically, and so has been cases from the Eastern Congo and the cases from Ivory Coast. So that's really what I'm trying to do in this text. Try to show the context of how this court came to be, what this course is trying to achieve, and really my contention with the course is that it is a sort of a continuation of the colonial way of, if you like, governing the universe, governing the world, particularly the ex-colonial spaces.
So,
Right.
okay, so help us understand your argument about the colonial nature, and that it's founded on colonialism and slavery. Um, is it? Are you saying that only because it was primarily trying to bring Africans to trial, or is it because there's something fundamental in the way in which the ICC and the Rome Statute were established?
Yeah, so I think I go a bit deeper than that. I look at the law itself. It's law versus the black body. Foundations of international law basically are founded on slavery mostly, right? The foundation of international law itself, particularly international trade law, right? What has turned out now to be international economic law. So the foundations of international law are mostly founded on slavery, right? So, and those foundations have then led to, well, what we now expanding to criminal law. But really, my argument in terms of slavery and colonialism is that we use what is mostly Eurocentric law, Eurocentric norms, legal norms, to essentially try to govern area spaces, mostly in the global south, right? And these spaces really, in terms of Eurocentric law, this law was exported to Africa, Asia, Latin America, for example, right? This was never our law. Criminal law as such, as we know it today, is a relatively new phenomenon in places like where I come from in Kenya, for example, right? But we in the global south have ended up taking this law, which was introduced to us as a way of colonizing us, right? So once we got independence as such, we inherited these criminal legal systems as our own, essentially. So if you like, colonizers in Kenya, settler colonizers left, they left the colonial criminal system intact, which then now is officiated and managed by black people, but essentially is a colonial system, right? There was no reform, there was no, if you like, making it indigenous in any way, right? So essentially, international criminal law really is a reproduction of colonial legal systems, right? And then if you come to the foundation of international criminal law, the Rome Statute, well, the name says it all, right? So then you have this statute, which is based mostly on Eurocentric legal norms, mostly, if you like, British legal systems and French, a bit of French legal system, brought together in this kind of mismatch of what people then call international. But essentially, the global south is absent in terms of its norms, its epistemologies, if you like, right? It's as if our people never had any legal systems before colonialism. So essentially, what you have is a system which is inherited from local systems, say British legal system, French legal system, and then it becomes an international legal system, if you like. Okay, so although you see African states becoming signatories to the Rome Statute, really African norms, African ways of resolving conflicts, for example, ideas like Ubuntu, which I deal with in my book, at the end of my book, were never really taken into account in drafting the Rome Statutes. Essentially, therefore, what you've got is a more colonial, Eurocentric legal system translated to be an international legal system. And then this legal system is supposed to resolve or solve conflict in far-fetched places like Congo, Ivory Coast, Central Africa. But essentially, what you're trying to do is use foreign Eurocentric law, Eurocentric ways of governing spaces to try and control conflict. So the problem really is essentially local ways of resolving conflicts in Africa are not reflected in international norms. So you end up having essentially people in Europe, people at The Hague. I would count myself, people here in Europe, going to Africa and saying, hey, this is the way you resolve your conflicts. But people have been resolving conflicts in Africa and the global south for centuries, but we don't ask them, hey, how have you been doing this? Right? How have you been resolving conflicts? So it's been like, hey, we've got these beautiful Rome statutes. Can you apply it in your situations? So there's that in terms of this law is not our law, right? Is a law that essentially as African lawyers we inherited from the colonial government. But at an international level, is even problematic because our ways of resolving conflicts have never been considered as part of international law, if you like, right? So,
Right. But the decision to prosecute, I mean, it seems to me we're talking about a period where there were some major illegal wars conducted, led by the United States, but with the collaboration of some of the signatories of the Rome Statute, including the United Kingdom. But the criminals responsible for those were not prosecuted.
well, yeah, well, we even have American soldiers committing crimes in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the ICC investigating it, and if you remember, President Trump intervening and even denying the then prosecutor visas to visit the US. We had cases where British soldiers were being investigated, but that has kind of been lost in a way. So in terms of international conflicts, so for example, we had the war in Iraq, which generally everybody now has evidence that that war was fought on false premises, and there's never been any follow-ups, legal follow-ups from that. So essentially, you've had conflicts that needed international attention, but has never been followed up in the sense that we see the African elite being followed up. But what I try to do in the book, really, to be very clear, is to say we're not saying that atrocities should not be punished. That's not what we're saying. We're saying, hey, why has there been this selectivity? Right? Why have we been? In fact, for example, one of cases I've looked at is the case against Bemba in the Eastern Congo. Right? He was essentially charged for war in Central African Republic. Right? But he's from East Congo, where in fact he was more active. So even in those very local situations, you can see where the criminal court was being, for example, in the Congolese situation, where the criminal court there was being used by the Kinshasa government to deal with Bemba, who was a presidential candidate, if you remember, right? So you can also see in Ivory Coast where two candidates for presidency. One was arrested by the French after a disputed presidential election. taken to The Hague, and that case eventually collapsed, right? Because obviously what happens is that in certain situations like the Ivory Coast, in Kenya, for example, in Congo, you see the French, the British, and the Americans intervening in local situations to support a preferred candidate, right? And one of really the disputed facts, really, in for example, the Kenyan situation in 2007, post-election violence, is the global West probably preferred one of the candidates, right? And one way of probably securing the win was to try and convict one of the candidates in that situation. So you can see global geopolitics playing up in these very, very selected cases. But really, the issue really is a global south. Do we have the capacity to deal with our conflict? That's really the question. Should we not be building the capacity to deal with our conflict? And my hypothesis has always been, of course, we have the capacity to resolve our conflict. And if you want evidence of whether we even have legal capacity to do that, you just need to look at the presidential election cases happening in Africa over recent times. There's been overturning of presidential elections in Kenya and Malawi of recent times, right? Where there was no violence, right? So there is a capacity of local judicial systems to deal with these high level cases, right? But you get this idea from the international space that these emerging democracies don't have the capacity. But actually, when you look closely, you see actually they do have capacity, but we don't want to push for that capacity to work. Okay.
Well, I mean, you make mention in your book of especially Macau Mutua's ideas around the third world approaches to international law.
Yes.
What are the third world approaches to international law?
So these are scholars like me who are looking at what has been happening. We're looking at international law really from, if you think, from the 50s, right? And we're looking at it as a way that the global south has been, if you like, governed after colonialism. So we're saying international law generally, particularly economic law, if you think of it, has been international economic law has been a way where the West influences the global south massively up to date. And we're saying there has to be an alternative, right? There cannot be that the West always has to prescribe for Africa and Latin America and Asia what they need to do with their economies, what they need to do with their legal systems, etc., etc. And what we're saying is, no, really, we, the global south, we know our situation. We have the solutions for our situations, particularly in economic law. What we're saying is neoliberalism and this hypercapitalism has destroyed the global south and has kind of stopped the global south to reach the promises we saw from our fathers in the 50s, right? And the global north, if you like, has pushed this neoliberal agenda since the 90s, aggressively pushed it, right? And what we're saying is, hey, stop. This neoliberal craziness, if you like, has not been good for the global south. Scholars in the global south, not just me, who is probably based here in London, people who are based in Africa, in Latin America, have been arguing this for years. So what we're saying is now we need another way. We need, if you like, a third way. We need our own solutions, our own economic models, if you like, right? But that really is what we're saying. We're saying these international sort of structures, the international criminal law doesn't work in providing peace and stability in situations in Africa. The economic international economic law It just works to provide global West with spaces to extract. And in a way, we saying, hey, we need a different way of doing things.
But okay, so you're arguing that there's a continuity of colonialism. I mean, albeit in a different era, and now with black presidents and so on. But is it a continuity of that past expression?
Yeah, even worse, even worse. You know, in the past, colonialism worked in that there was no lie. There was no lying that, you know, we colonizing you. We're here to extract your resources by force. But what is worse with what happens today is that what was happening last couple of centuries continues to happen, and we told we are independent and we can make our own decisions, and particularly at the minute you get these situations where African countries particularly are borrowing extremely large amounts of money to build these infrastructural projects, which, if you look at what is happening now, they're going to be in debt, they're being in debt that they can't even service. Okay. So we have to look at the current economic model. Who is it working for, right? So essentially, in the past, we were colonized by force. But what is happening today is even worse, because really, you're being told, okay, come, let's negotiate these credit facilities, but these credit facilities will indebt your countries for centuries, essentially, right?
Mm.
That is just the economic law. On the international criminal law, for example, you've seen the examples I was giving you of Ivory Coast, where local populations think they're going through a democratic process, and one candidate could be grabbed by a Western nation and taken to The Hague, essentially removed from the scene. So essentially, what is happening now is worse, because African communities, particularly, are voluntarily signing up for these international uh, law, international projects,
But
right?
you know, you talk about an African way of doing things, and let's take the example of South Africa uh, with its constitution, Bill of Rights, held up as the sort of great achievement. But the reality is what in South Africa? To what extent have the Truth and Reconciliation process actually resolved anything in that sense? To what extent does South Africa still remain the continuity of a particular form of colonialism?
Yeah, and I've actually dealt with that particular point in the book, because of what I'm saying is, so, you know, friends of democracy always find this point very, very disturbing. For example, when I mention it, what we were told in Africa is that, okay, freedom comes, but you have to democratize, right? So from the day you were supposed to be an independent state, we all supposed to be equal. Okay, so there was no looking back at the structural, if you like, legacies of apartheid, of colonialism, right? And like I was saying earlier on, in places like South Africa, Kenya, Zimbabwe, the colonial legal system remained intact,
Hmm.
right? So, and one of the most important bits, really, we never talk about, which we have to talk about, is become a hot issue in South Africa, is ownership, right? Ownership of capital, and how industry pre 1994, right, is still the industry today in terms of ownership, right? So essentially, people are free, but are they free? Right? They don't own the economy is still in the same hands as it was in 1990. And that happens in South Africa, that happens in Zimbabwe, that happens in Kenya, in Namibia. That happens in every settler colonial community you can think of in Africa. So the problem really is that although these so-called independent states have a black president, really they don't control their economies, right? And that really has dire consequences. For example, think of Zimbabwe, right? I give people this example, and I want people to wake up. Think of Zimbabwe, which was supposedly an independent country until Robert Mugabe started to say, hey, we want our land back. And their economy was collapsed. It's never recovered up to today, right? Because the economy was not in black ownership, was not in black hands, it was not. So the colonial population, the settler population, still controlled a vast section of the economy, and most profitable sections of the economy are foreign owned. So although neoliberalism says foreign investment is positive for these countries, foreign investment in some situations is very risky for these countries, because one day they fall out with the global West, and the global West withdraws their investments. So when you look at the Truth and Reconciliation, for example, one of the issues it never dealt with was the economy, right? What should have happened to the economy? Should, for example, redistribution have happened then, right? And what then happens is, if you don't deal with those issues of redistribution early on, they become a bit of a problem as you progress. Because because when you have democracy, when you have protection of property in your constitution, is in your independent constitution, it becomes a problem for you to then want to, in a way, redistribute what is now privately owned. You get me? So the problem really is that, if you like, the independent constitutions never looked at this issue of redistribution, right? The issue was, okay, now we equal, now we free, now we have a democracy, and this democracy is a property owning democracy, right? So, and that is a problem for it's not going to go away, right? Because these countries have major problems with inequalities. You know, the gaps between the rich and the poor in places like Kenya, South Africa, are huge. So, and how you deal with those issues in terms of building a welfare state, for example, in the future will need some form of redistribution, right?
Yeah.
And that's problematic.
So let me explore something with you. I mean, some people would argue that the whole human rights movement is similar to the development movement in the way that it depoliticizes the situation. It extirpates the issue from the actual context, and it's a tradition that requires victims. I mean, you
Yes,
can't.
yes.
It's you use the term the white savior in international law, and it's the same tradition again of saviors can only survive if they have victims. So they are the primary victimizers. You know, they prevent people from the population from being actually engaged in the creation of the conditions for justice, the creation of conditions for resolution. What's your response to that?
Oh, exactly. So here's the thing, right? So I come from a region where my grandfathers and mothers took arms against colonialism, right? So they were, if you like, the original human rights defenders. And I want the listener to get this point, okay? So in 1940s and 50s, our fathers and grandfathers in Kenya, India, Pakistan, every colonized space took arms, protested against colonialism. They were the original human rights defenders. So we, as people from the global south, we owned, if you like, human rights. We human rights. We were fighting the West because the West was not safeguarding our human rights. Okay, fast forward the formation of United Nations, and then even further, fast forward 1990, and our spaces where our people originally were the human rights defenders and fought for our freedoms, right? They are seen as not knowing what human rights and freedom and equality is. And I want really the listener to get this point. So our people have always fought for human rights, equalities, redistribution. That was, if you like, the only reason why me and you Filoze are here discussing these ideas, right? Is because our forefathers fought, gave us these ideas to, we inherit what we're discussing here from what we learned from our fathers, right? Because we come from a place where people fought for rights. And then the West, for some reason or the other, captures this, right? You know, you've heard of this idea of state capture. So the West essentially captures this idea of human rights, democracy, and makes it their own space. And they have to come and donate it to our spaces, right? Is one of the most interesting, if you like, psychological mess ups you can ever think of. If the West has ever thought of human rights, you know, why did we have to fight for our spaces to be liberated? But let's come to your point on the victim. The victim has been, if you like, the reason why international law exists today. That's one of the ideas I borrow in terms of Black iconography, right? The icon of this miserable, poor African woman who needs to be saved by a white man, and more recently, white woman. So is this idea that, you know, poor Black child needs to be saved by white people always, but the idea of the white savior works well when there's conflict. Because when there's conflict, we all agree, okay, these need to stop. Somebody needs to come and stop this, right? But for example, if I fast forward to what is happening today in the Sudan, right? I don't think, I'm not sure. I need to check my research. I'm not sure whether Sudan produces arms, right? So somebody must be providing arms to the two sides in conflict in the Sudan today. Okay, the Sudan does not produce arms. The generals either side do not have enough money, and I need to emphasize on this, to maintain a war as long as they're maintaining a war. So somebody externally is funding and resourcing the conflict in the Sudan today. But then you will have to find sooner or later somebody coming from outside trying to say, hey, we're coming to save you people from yourselves. So what I'm suggesting in this book is that this idea of a savior and a victim, particularly the African woman is the victim, is the reason why international law thrives. And I say in my book, for example, you know, I come from central Kenya, and those of you who understand central Kenya, the Gikuyu women were some of the most, if you like, the amongst the freedom fighters, right? And to think of African women who fought for independence to be victims forever. For me, I don't welcome that thought. I like to see my African women as heroes, as people who actually are able to fight for their rights and have been doing that for centuries, to be honest. So this idea that we, particularly African men, um, um, essentially thrive in conflict and victimize our own sisters and mothers, that's an imported idea. It's never been an African idea. And we need to resist that idea that our mothers and sisters are victims, right? And really, revisit those 1950s ideas of hey, we were the people who were fighting for freedom when new people had occupied our territories by force. So the idea that the West has any human rights to donate to Africa and Latin America and Asia is a creation of their own fantasies. It's not real.
Let me move the discussion onto this whole issue of criminal law. I mean, is prosecution a means for achieving justice? Is it a means for resolving conflicts in where there have been major popular contestations? Does prosecution resolve that?
No, it doesn't. Give me an example. It doesn't. No. So I've given in my book. I've given an example. Right. When I was doing the research for this book, 26% of all the cases at the ICC came from, they do still, from Eastern Congo. Right. As we speak today, there is conflict in that region, despite all the cases being tried at the ICC. Right. So obviously, that's an example that intervention does not bring peace. Okay, so the problem with criminal law as an intervention, particularly at the national level, is that it does not deal with the structural causes of violence, of conflict.
Right. So to bring it up to what's happening today, why is Putin being charged and not Tony Blair? I mean, help me understand.
I think so. The first thing to say there is this, really, because I'm getting a lot of bother because of this Ukraine-Russian issue. So to understand what's happening in Ukraine, I want to deal with the Ukraine issue quickly because for the purposes of those who've been in a way attacking my position. What I'm saying is to really appreciate what is happening in Ukraine, you got to revisit the 1990s. Okay, and you've got to understand the negotiations and the discussions that were held by the United States. If you remember people like James Baker, if you remember Helmut Kohl, if you remember Margaret Thatcher, if you remember the collapse of the Russian Federation and the formation of countries like Ukraine. And this is the most crucial bit, and the unification of Germany, right? And they were general agreements on how far east NATO should push, right? Now, to understand the formation of these conflicts, people have got to go back and look at those discussions and read about what was agreed upon. I'm not saying I support the invasion of Ukraine. I'm just saying there is context to conflict, right? And when at an international level we don't deal with the context and we use criminal law as a way to try and resolve that conflict, we mostly add fuel to a place where resolution will eventually come from people sitting down. Okay, so that's one thing. So people need to revisit the 1990s. The second thing people need to do is wonder this. International criminal law was supposed to be a peace building initiative. The international criminal law was not meant to be a war management tool. We should not be using the international criminal law to try and manage a war. So what we should be saying is, hey, there is evidence that international law has been broken, and we follow the evidence and convict whomever is breaking the law. There should not be a situation where the United Nations is almost managing a war instead of intervening to bring peace. Does that make sense? So they should not be saying, okay, war should continue and we're going to use the International Criminal Court as one of the way to punish war. We should be, as an international community, saying, hey, let's stop this war fast, right? So the international community should not be managing a war, should be stopping a war. That's my point.
But you know, some would argue that, well, okay, so now Putin, he's not a black guy; he's a white guy, you know. So does that, to what extent does that challenge the validity of your argument that you present in this book?
Well, for one thing, you've got to look at what Putin is being charged with. For example, Putin is being charged for transporting children from Ukraine to Russia. He's actually not being charged for the crime, the major crime, which is the crime of aggression. Okay, so Putin will not see the Hague. There is nobody who is going to arrest Putin. There's nobody, as it happened in Ivory Coast, who is going to go to Moscow and arrest Putin, handcuff him, and take him to the Hague. It's not going to happen. Okay? There's no way Putin would stand trial at the Hague. Right? First, you've got to understand how the Security Council intervenes in international law, for example, right? So there's no way Putin is going to face trial at Hague. Well, he could be tried in absentia, but you're not going to see Putin at the Hague, full stop. That's just the reality. That's just the geopolitical reality. Now, the reason why that situation does not apply to my theory is actually I'm not saying international criminal law should not exist and should not function. All I'm saying in my book is, hey, we as African people, we have the capacity to deal with our conflict, and we can try our war in Africa. In fact, what I've suggested in my book is that the African Human Rights Court should very rapidly being in operation, because there's been an African Human Rights Court in process for a while. So I'm actually not against international criminal law as such. Right. If you read my book, and if you read my proposals, what I'm saying is I just don't want to see men like me being tried by white people at the Hague. You know, considering the history and considering the historical connotations, particularly what I say in the book is, for example, considering, for example, the Netherlands was one of the major slavery traders, right? Considering that city was built on crimes committed in the past, right? The Dutch East India Company, right, grabbing in Asia, right? Here's a fact which most people don't understand. The Netherlands were the first country to export slaves to Africa. That's a thought, huh? And now they're the people trying to say, hey, we the ones to try, we the ones who are custodians for this new world order. So what I'm trying really to say is, until the past is reckoned with, right, until these countries are able to account for what they've done in the past, right, they should not continue selling themselves as custodians of this fair and just international order, right?
So let's then turn to the argument that you end with in your book, and that is about an African system for that. And I mean, for example, I mean, what's your view about the gacaca system, which was implemented for a while in Rwanda?
Yes. So and that's one of the idea which I think we should actually have followed and built on, and which has never been followed and built on, for example, because that was an idea where crimes committed locally were actually tried locally, if you like, right, where people were really answerable to their local communities, right, and also particularly because really when violence happens in a communal sense, it's very, very difficult for you really to blame just one person. Okay. So when communal violence happens, it's communal violence, and people have to deal with it in a communal sense. And that format really helps in the sense that people own what happened and they deal with it locally. Right. So if you take a classic case where a case is brought at the ICC, for example, and I deal with this issue in terms of, say, Kenyan cases, right? So you take these two people at The Hague, right? But the people who really killed and destroyed people at the local level were never charged, or never faced any justice, right? So the Rwanda idea really was a brilliant idea, still a brilliant idea, where people at a community level say, okay, this bad thing has happened to us as a community. How do we deal with it as a community? The people who killed in the community need to be held accountable by the community, rather than some funny-looking judges at The Hague, because really there's no connection between the international system and the local level, and that's a big problem in terms of what happens at The Hague. Because really, if you take what happens at the Eastern Congo, for example, right? So people being taken to The Hague, right? But every day there's violence in the east of Congo, right? So the people there must be wondering, how come? How come? It's because obviously there's no local mechanism. I hope there are local mechanisms, and I need to check on this point, where people really are accountable to the communities.
Well, finally, let's bring it back to Kenya. I mean,
Yes.
there is violence every day, especially against the wretched of the earth, the most disenfranchised people. There are hundreds of killings by police, but with no accountability, no prosecution. And indeed, if one goes back to the post-election violences in 2007, we have exactly the same thing. Not one person has been prosecuted, in spite of documentary evidence of the kind of violations, especially carried out by the state, not just by ethnic groups. It was carried out by the state, the GSU to some extent, but the police was directly involved. And there are films showing these abuses, and nothing has been done. So under those circumstances, what are we going to do? What kind of popular African way of resolving this situation would you propose?
Listen, I'm happy. So I was in Kenya a couple of weeks back. Yeah, I'm happy to have had the current president saying he's going to stop these extrajudicial killings, right? Which has been happening with people being disappeared and killed randomly, right? I think that's a positive. what I say in my book is this, and this is the point I want to really keep on pushing and dwelling on. The law does not respect the black body, right? The current African state is not an African state, it's a colonial state. Well, it just has black officials, but it's a colonial state. So the police, the Kenyan police, they deal with the Kenyan people as if they were colonial officers, right? There needed to have been, if you like, these kind of, Google calls it the decolonizing of the mind in the 1960s. There needed to be a point where we as Africans really understood what the state is and was supposed to be for. So the colonial state was not a state that respected us as black people. And when we inherited that system with black officials, we continued treating our people as if we, the people, are still colonized, right? So there's a whole debate to be had in terms of decolonizing the mind, in this idea of the police officer looking at me and respecting me as a human being. Right, that happens in Kenya, that happens here in the UK, that happens in the United States. The colonial state does not respect the black body, full stop. So what should happen in places like Kenya is we should be, and people are engaging with this debate, I might say, we should now start asking, hey, why are you as a police officer not looking at me as a human being? Where does that come from? Right, and that comes from this idea of we never decolonized our state. The state still treats our people as if they were colonized, as if they are occupied. So until the state actors really view their people with respect, decolonizes their thinking about the people, we still going to have these problems ongoing. Right, but really, the most important violence really visited on our people is an economic sort of violence, right? Where the people's livelihoods been destroyed by this rampant neoliberalism, right? Where people cannot provide for their families, where people don't have decent housing, where people don't have access to healthcare, right? These are the sort of violences we need to be speaking about. Although I really, really see the point of the state being violent against the people, which comes from that colonial space, and that needs re-educating our people, right? Not just state officials. In fact, the way we relate to each other, right? From these colonial sort of class-based system, which doesn't make sense in our setting, for example, right? But most importantly, what I'm trying to say is that until we can reaffirm our people's dignity in a more holistic way, that our people have a decent living standards, our people have food for their families, housing, healthcare, right? Then the African state remains violent. Whether it's not killing people in the streets or not, it is fundamentally a violent state where you as a Kenyan, as a poor Kenyan, to be honest, because there's a whole bunch of wealthy Kenyans who don't experience the day-to-day struggles, but for that wretched of the earth person, then the state is forever violent, even if the violence is not active violence, if you get my point. So what I'm saying is we need to look at the economic models we're running in some African states like Kenya. Are these economic models still in a way dehumanizing our people? But we also need to decolonize the state and the state actors.
Well, I think that's a good point to end with, and that is that it is this process of dehumanization, which is really the essence of racism, and which you argue in your book, that so long as people are treated as less than human, So then systems like the International Criminal Court and other colonial forms of justice really don't deliver that justice and doesn't. And you've raised this issue about the economic and social conditions of our people, and it's not going to be resolved in the courts, I would guess.
No, it's not. It's not. It's hopefully these start a conversation where we're going to have more of these conversations. But really, what I want us to really focus on is this idea of reaffirming our people's dignity, right? This idea of challenging these colonial mentality where violence is visited on our people, and we get used to viewing it as almost a normal occurrence, right? So we need to reaffirm the dignity of our people. We need to revisit the spirit of the 50s and I dare say the 40s, where our forefathers were really for the dignity of our people, and where we saw our people as authors of their own futures.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Mwangi Wanjiru, author of Black Iconography and Colonial Reproduction at the ICC. A really important book and strongly recommended to you all. Thank you for joining us today, and we will end the broadcast just shortly, but don't leave the studio. We'll have a conversation after we've logged out. So this is Stephen Mwangi wishing you all well, and thank you for joining us on this show today.